Are there any questions about the homework assignment that is due tomorrow? Sometime tomorrow. Any time tomorrow, except, up to 5 minutes before midnight? No questions about that? You guys know what the assignment looks like? Yep.
I'll ask you after class.
Is it a assignment related problem or
It's just like
question?
Yeah, it's just kind of a specific question. Like, I'll just ask you after class.
Okay, that's fine. Okay, I just want to bring up the homework assignment first, just so that everybody knows, what the homework assignment looks like. 4 people have turned it in. That's good. Yeah, I don't need to recover that. Okay, so this is the homework assignment that you have to turn in sometime tomorrow before 11:55 p.m. And it looks really simple. The main program has one single print statement. It prints the result of the invocation of S1. 2 is the parameter to 2 is the argument to parameter n. And inside the subroutine, it first checks whether n equals to 0. If it does, you return the 0 right away. If it does not equal to 0, you have to return the invocation of S1 again, but this time use n minus 1 to specify n, plus 2 times n minus 1. Okay?
Oh, that
yep. Go ahead.
When we return, like,
Mhm.
when we go through a couple, we find that n is 0, so then we return 0, but we don't actually return 0, we return 0 plus 2 times n minus 1, right?
Okay, so your question is basically, related to what do you do when you execute a return statement? That's basically what you're asking. Now, when you execute a return statement, all you do is to copy and paste the return info cell, change the question mark to the value that you're returning. But you do not execute the statement inside the return info cell until you get back onto that line. Okay, so the tricky part is when you do execute the statement inside the return info cell, the context would have changed. Okay, certain columns will no longer be available, so you have to make sure you use the right n when you execute the statement inside the return info cell. So that's what you need to be careful about. Okay. It may be helpful if you review one of the sample programs that we have done last week on Thursday.
I was looking at the option one, I think.
Right.
But that one was a little more complicated.
That one is a little bit more complicated. You can also look at the other one. In fact, we have to cover this last topic before we move onto the next section. Okay, this is one thing that you have to look at is the updated subroutine notes. Okay, because it has some of the newer stuff that we talked about in this class that is not captured in the previous notes. So the question that you asked me basically has to do with 7.3, which is return to a return. And in this case, we have a factorial program. The structure of this trace will be similar to the structure of the trace for the homework assignment. The calculation is different. The type of calculation you have to go through is different. But in terms of the structure, in terms of how you allocate and deallocate the columns, would be about the same. So what you want to do is to focus on what do we do on line 4 and what do we do on line 6 of this program. So focus on those particular parts. When you look at the trace, you basically want to see, okay, this part here, this is the execution of line 4. When we execute line 4, which is returning 1, all we do is to copy the return info cell to over here, and then we change the question mark to the value that you're returning. But we do not execute line 6 at this point. Okay, you leave line 6 just like this. We have resolved what line 6 should be like when we execute it, but we do not execute it yet. Because the next line following line 4 is line 8, which is the end of the subroutine. On line 8, what we do is we deallocate the 2 columns that we allocated for that invocation. And then we go back. Okay? And then we go back to line 6. But when we go back to line 6 of row 14 of this trace, line 6 will look like this at this point because we have resolved what the invocation is returning. So that's why we are executing line 6 as return n times 1 when we get back to row 14 of the trace. At that time, n is no longer this n because this n is already deallocated. So at that time, n is 2. And in other words, when you execute return n times 1, you're basically returning 2. Now when you execute return 2, you go to the return info cell, you copy and paste it, and then you replace the question mark with the value of 2. Okay, so this one is a good example to kind of look into again, to review when you do your homework assignment. Because the structure of this trace is similar, not exactly the same, but similar to what you have to do with your homework assignment. Okay. Any other questions regarding the homework assignment or the return value topic? No questions? Okay. If there are no questions about that, there is one more section that I added into this notes here. If I go all the way back to the top, you can see from the date that I have been messing around with it, like this morning, really late this morning. The note that I added to this one has to do with what can be passed by reference. Okay, so this part is new. Section 6.3 is new. The question is, what can we use to specify a by-ref parameter? Because a by-ref parameter is an alias of a column, it makes sense that only objects that represent columns can be passed by reference to a parameter. Okay? Okay, let's just take a look at the example here. I have a sample program here and an explanation below that. Here is my subroutine. The subroutine reset doesn't really do a whole lot. All it does is to take a parameter x that is passed by reference, which means x is an alias to some other column. And all it does is to reset the value of that column to 0. That's all it does. So the problem or the tricky part is not with reset. Reset is easy. The tricky part has to do with main. Let's take a look at main and only up to the first invocation. There's no problem, no tricky business up to here. When you look at subroutine main, it has a local variable I. Do local variables have their own columns? Yeah, they do, right? So as a result, on line 7, when I invoke reset and use the local variable I to pass by reference to x, there's no problem because I is a variable. It has a column. When I pass variable I by reference to x, that means that x becomes an alias of that same column. Does it make sense? Okay. So that's not a problem. We don't have any problem with line 7. And if you look at the trace, it basically does that. X becomes an alias of column C because column C is what we allocated for local variable I. So this is stuff that we already know and should not have a problem with. The problem has to do with what do we do on line 8. Now line 8 is a little bit strange because if you look at the left-hand side of the parameter x, oh, and by the way, this part of the invocation is called the argument. Okay, this is called the argument that specifies the parameter x in this case. Okay? When you look at this argument, does it specify a column? What exactly is that? I mean, 20 times I plus 2 in parentheses. It's an expression, okay? It's a calculation, right? At this point, I will be reset to 0 because of line 6. So we are calculating 0 plus 2, which is 2, and 20 times 2 is 40. Okay? The value of 40 does not have a column. It is not a variable. It is not passed by value. It is not passed by reference. It is just a transient value that we have calculated on the fly when we execute line 8. As a result, what am I going to do with this? Because x is supposed to be an alias of something, and on the other side, on the left-hand side, I have a little expression here that does not have a column. So what we do is we allocate a column. Okay? If it does not have a column and we need to have a column, we just allocate a column on the fly. And that's basically what the trace is indicating. When we execute line 8, okay, this is the execution of line 8, What we do is we dynamically allocate column D in this case to store the result of the calculation, which is 40. Is that okay so far? Normally we don't. Okay, normally we don't allocate a column, but in this case we do because X wants to be an alias of a column. So when we set up, X becomes an alias of column D. Are we doing okay so far? Now, what is important about column D, or this column here, or this, the column that stores the value of 40? What is really important about this is the only way to get to this column is by parameter X of the subroutine reset. It has no name otherwise. Okay, this column does not have a name. And what is also more interesting is after reset, okay, so the reset subroutine will reset this value to 0, and then we get out of the subroutine. When we get back to the main program, these 3 columns would have been deallocated already, which means to the main subroutine, the effect of the reset subroutine would be completely, ignored. I mean, there's no visible effect whatsoever when we invoke reset, because the column that it works on is transient. Okay, it only lives as long as the invocation statement executes, and it disappears as soon as the invocation statement is done. Are there any questions about this? I mean, do you guys understand the point of this discussion? Somewhat? Kind of? Not really? Yes? Okay. Now, why do I have to talk about this? I mean, this sounds like a fairly obscure topic, but it does happen. Okay? When you use C++ as a programming language, you can pass parameters by reference. And guess what? You can also do this. Okay? If you have a parameter that is passed by reference, you can actually use an expression as an argument to that parameter. And this is exactly what happens when you use a C++ program using an expression to specify a pass by reference parameter. So that's why it is relevant to this class. It is also going to be relevant to your C++ class, which is cisp300. Does anyone have any plan to learn Python? No one? Okay, so I'm going to raise my hand here. In Python, there is no such thing as pass by value. Every parameter in Python is passed by reference. So as a result, something like this is bound to happen when you write programs in Python. So you will see this again because Python is becoming a more and more popular programming language. So many of you, even though you don't have to take that class as a part of your certificate or your degree, you will learn Python one way or another for one reason or another. Okay? Are there any questions about this particular slide before we move on? No questions about this? Okay. If there are no questions about this, we'll go through one more sample program with subroutines, and then we'll move on to records. The topic 10. We probably won't have enough time to finish everything in topic 10. We'll try to finish as much as we can. But for the time being, we'll go ahead and finish one last sample program with, where's my office? Right here. With subroutines. And this is also something that you will see in cisp300 with the name of post increment. Okay? Post increment will take one parameter that is passed by reference. We'll just call it x in this case. It will also have a local variable t, and the first thing it does is to make a copy of x